solving the jihadist problems is not on the priority list of the military juntas, not in Bamako, not in Niamey, and not in Ouagadougou. Because let's be very clear about this. A military confrontation between any of the AES countries and Algeria is going to be an absolute disaster for the Sahel. The coup was widely welcomed in Mali at the time because President Boubacar Keïta was incredibly unpopular. There was basically only one standing operating procedure in that government, and that was corruption. They are having intelligence services, but the intelligence services are used to spy on the opposition to the governments in place. They are not there to spy on menaces to national sovereignty or threats to the population at large. Russia doesn't change anything. It sends arms. It probably uses Mali as a conduit also to send arms through to its other theaters on the African continent, most notably the Central African Republic. And it obviously takes a colossal amount of gold from both Mali and Burkina Faso to finance its war against Ukraine. So that's $2.5, $3 billion over the past 2 years have disappeared from both countries and probably other countries as well, including Sudan before the war, including the Central African Republic. And all that goes into the coffers of the Russian state eventually, which it uses to finance its war against Ukraine.
What happens when the world stops pretending to care about Africa? The Sahel is on fire. The French troops are gone. Russia's Wagner military continue to extend their military operation in the Sahel region. Is this the new rise of anti-Western sentiment, or is it the new chapter of resource exploitation in the region? Mr. Bram Posthumus is one of the renowned journalists and analysts who has worked in West Africa and in the Sahel region to uncover truth in his journalistic work. He has agreed to sit with us in this edition of Unpopular Opinion to discuss the current political tension between Mali and Algeria. Mr. Brad Posthumus, thank you so much for joining us on this edition of Unpopular Opinion. It is an absolute honor for us to have you. And, for a start, you've worked extensively across the Sahel region and the West African region. You've covered a lot of news, informations in politics, in social life, in cultural life. You've covered that extensively. We want you to start with the historical ties between Mali and Algeria, and where do you think the current crisis is coming from? Because you have written that Mali and Algeria are reluctant allies. So could you please unpack all of those various layers as we begin the show?
Okay, thank you very much for this question, Mohammed. And it's let me also say that it's an absolute pleasure to be on this podcast. A good experience for me again as well. We do have a bit of a history to take into account here. If you go all the way back to the 1960s, the early 1960s, when Mali got its independence from France, Algeria was fighting a war against France, the War of Independence, which was a horrific affair. And it lasted until 1962. And Mali has always been of assistance to Algeria during that war because they considered, France being the former colonial power, or in the case of Algeria, still the colonial power, and a hostile one at that was waging war against a fellow African nation. So that's kind of like the genesis of the relationship between the two countries. And they have existed side by side for decades after that. You remember that they share an almost 1,400 kilometers long border through the Sahara Desert, which has always been open in the sense that people could cross back and forth, whether or not without valid papers and all the rest of it, because how do you control 1,400 kilometers of desert? That's virtually impossible. Things started to change when Algeria had the horrendous tragedy of being subjected to a civil war in the 1990s. And again, France hasn't played a very good role in this, to put it very mildly, because if you go back to the early 1990s, there was an election, and the election was won by what was called the Front for Islamic Salvation, the FIS. It was pretty much an Islamic group, that political party that wanted to have Islam as the guiding principle for, how to run a nation. That was stopped by a military coup, which was backed by France, whether actively or passively, that's up for debate. But France obviously was okay with the generals taking over power. And that event plunged Algeria into a terrible, terrible, terrible civil war that lasted for almost a decade and killed probably something like 200,000 people, and has been incredibly almost forgotten by the rest of the world. It was a horrific time. And at the end of this war, Algeria, basically the securocrats, as they call them, so that's the military and the all-powerful intelligence service of Algeria, decided to export their jihadist problem to the neighbors, because it was a war between the military government and jihadist groups, which were starting to call themselves the the Armed Group of Islamists, the GIA, which later became Al-Qaeda. So they first tried Mauritania, that failed, and then they thought of this 1,400-kilometer border with Mali, and so let's throw it across the border into Mali. And in the early 2000s, these groups started operating out of the vast open desert in the north of Mali and started abducting Europeans, which gave them seed money for their campaigns of terror and enabled them to get arms, enabled them to buy arms. And then that started festering, but was still confined to the northern part of Mali until the, again, blatantly illegal action in which France once again played a major role, which was, of course, the overthrow of the Libyan leader, Colonel Gaddafi, which freed up a colossal amount of arms, which were taken on by rebels, Tuareg rebels in the beginning, who entered into the north of Mali and started their rebellion in about 2012, which then degenerated into the terrible situation we have in Mali today. And Mali has always had suspicions against Algeria that they were supporting these Tuareg rebels. We have to be very precise in our terminology here. When the Malian junta of the colonel, now General Assimi Goïta, refers to terrorists, what they mean are these Tuareg rebels. There is a long-standing feud, a long-standing time of animosity between the governments of Mali, whether they were military or civilian, and various incarnations of Tuareg rebels going back to the 1960s, when there was a first rebellion, another one in the 90s, another one in the early 21st century, and then another one in 2012. And they have always been punctuated, if you like, by massacres of Malian soldiers by Tuareg rebels. And the main motivator for the Malian army to go after these Tuareg rebels is revenge. Revenge for their slain comrades, the comrades that were killed by the Tuareg rebels. And so this is when they started advancing on the old rebel stronghold of Kidal, which was, in their view, liberated in November 2023. And then it concentrated on this flashpoint that now everybody knows, this little place right on the border between Mali and Algeria, which is called Tinzaouaten. And that's where we now have the infamous incident of the Malian drone shot down by the Algerians, and claims and counterclaims. The Malians saying, you shot it down, it was our drone, and you shot it down over our airspace. And the Algerians saying, no, 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 it was in our airspace. We had every right to shoot it down. And so that's where we are right now. Mali continues to accuse Algeria of supporting these Tuareg terrorists. Algeria says it's none of your business. You have caused all sorts of problems by starting your offensive against the Tuaregs. And now you have 1,400 kilometers of mistrust between two countries that should have a harmonious relationship, but don't because of all these extra things that have come into play over the past decade and a half.
For our listeners, if you are just joining us, I'd like to encourage you to please subscribe to this YouTube channel by liking, commenting, sharing, as well as recommending individuals to us that are doing remarkable works in their various countries across the African continent. We will try to bring them to this podcast to listen to the kind of work they are doing across Africa. So thank you very much, Mr. Bram. I want us to look at Algeria's strategic interest in this area. What is Algeria's strategic interest, as well as the three juntas, military juntas in the Sahel region, like the Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger? They've also threatened that if there is any attack on Malian territorial integrity, will be an aggression against them. What does this mean for the regional peace, especially the Sahel region, as well as the West African region? What can you tell us about that?
I think first and foremost, you all have to understand about how Algeria is run. It is run by securocrats, if you like. And they have one program which is safeguarding the country, national security. And in their mind, that means more than anything else, it means keeping the armed Islamist groups away from the country. That's what their policies have been about. And from their perspective, all you can say is that they have been very successful in doing that because the civil war is obviously over. It has been over for more than 20 years, less than 20 years, about 15 years. The armed Islamist groups are perhaps still a little bit in the south of the country, but certainly in no way a menace to the government or to the big population centers like the capital Algiers or Tamanrasset in the south. And they have successfully exported their jihadist problem specifically into Mali. And because of Mali's instability, it has spread now to many other parts of the subcontinent, and specifically, of course, the neighbors, Niger and Burkina Faso, and even the coastal areas, including Cote d'Ivoire, where I'm speaking from right now, where the North has had a series of attacks. And of course, not far from this city, Abidjan, we had a big attack in a seaside resort called Grand Bassam in 2016, when almost 22 people were killed by suspected jihadist assailants. So there is a national interest here also to keep following what's happening in the Sahel. The perspective of countries like Mali and Burkina Faso is a completely different one. The obsession with the Malian army is very much with Tuareg rebels, and they want national cohesion, national unity, if you like. And in their minds, certainly in the military minds, this means getting these Tuareg rebels out of the country. Now, where do they go? The natural exit is through Algeria, which is where the refugees went when Kidal was taken by the Malian army and its Russian mercenary partners. And of course, the rebel movement itself, which, either stays hiding in the Ifoghas mountain, which are behind Kidal, or indeed go into Algeria, and stage another rebellion. Because I can tell you one thing, the next rebellion is a matter of time because the problems have not been solved. There is another aspect to this as well. There was a peace accord, however fragile and however fraught with mistakes, between the Malian government and Tuareg rebels. It was called the Algiers Peace Accord of 2015. Hardly anybody believed in it, but it was some sort of a guidebook, if you like, a bit of a roadmap to how to solve this perennial Tuareg rebel problem. And General Assimi Goïta put an end to this by not only taking Kidal, but formally tearing up the peace accord. And obviously, the Algerians have been mightily annoyed by this because they were the ones who brokered it. In fact, they pretty much wrote the texts, which is why nobody believed in it, because there was hardly any Malian participation in drafting the Algiers peace accord. So they didn't own it. So they didn't feel responsible for keeping it, which is why hardly anybody took it seriously. But it was a document that was supposedly this wonderful, brilliant roadmap. And what General Goïta did was basically confirm what everybody already knew. This Algiers peace accord is dead But doing this in the manner that he did by military action, again, raised the tensions with Algeria. In terms of the jihadist insurgencies, which is obviously the other problem, and arguably, certainly in places like Burkina Faso and Niger, and also in other parts of Mali, arguably the bigger problem. I'm going to be pretty controversial here, I think, by telling you that solving the jihadist problems is not on the priority list of the military juntas, not in Bamako, not in Niamey, and not in Ouagadougou. The priority of the military juntas, apart from obviously keeping the Tuareg rebel movement out of Mali, is to maintain themselves in power. That's their raison d'etre. That's why they are there. That's why they turn the capital cities into fortresses. And that's why they have, for instance, now a Russian partner which sees the countries of the Sahel as geostrategic pawns that they can use in their efforts to destabilize whole regions of the world on the cheap. That's the main thing. It's cheap destabilization. It's happening here in Côte d'Ivoire. It's happening in other parts of the world as well. So the priorities are quite different. And one final thing I'd like to add here as well is that Niger has an economic structure that is fundamentally different from those of Mali and Burkina Faso. Both Mali and Burkina Faso rely principally on the exportation of gold for their revenue, customs, royalty, levies, taxes, and all the rest of it. And they are putting pressure on specifically Western mining houses to pay more taxes, which so far the Australians and Canadians and South Africans have been prepared to do because they still see that there is a profit that can be had. It's gold mining, so the communities around the gold mines or the countries involved do not benefit at all from the presence of foreign-owned gold mines in their communities, regions. It's pretty much an enclave economy, but it's good for the state and for the government because it gives them the money they need to, for instance, buy arms, which is what Mali does, obviously, mostly in Russia now. And this is a curious little thing as well. Just a little side note, but it's significant. Quite possibly the biggest client for arms made in Russia is Algeria. It's been all the military kit they're using is Russia, be it air, sea, tanks, whatever. It's all Russian. Mali has also become an important client for Russian military hardware. There is no indication whatsoever that anybody in Moscow is interested in mediating between these two countries. There is no effort on the way to mediate between Algeria and Mali, whereas because of the economic ties, Russia would be the obvious choice, but it's not happening. Even when they went to see Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov just days before this incident with the drone happened, there's still been no indication that Moscow wants to mediate. Now back to the economy, and that's the final point. Niger exports uranium. In the mines, there were a couple of mines, but the big mines up in the north of Niger were run by a French company, which scandalously underpaid the Nigerian authorities for what they took out of the ground and the stuff that keeps the light on in France, because as you well know, France is heavily reliant on nuclear energy for its electricity provisions. So that's the Nigerian junta has removed the French from those mines, and they will probably be looking at the Chinese to sell the mines to, because the Chinese are interested in resources in Niger, and of course the Chinese are already heavily involved in Niger's oil industry, because oil was found in the southeast of the country near Diffa. There is an oil field and a pipeline that runs through Benin, which is operated by the Chinese National Petroleum Corporation. So the Chinese are already heavily engaged in the oil industry. And very interestingly, there is another oil player active in Niger. What's the name? Algeria. Algeria's state Sonatrach oil company is preparing a project, a multi-billion-dollar project, oil project in Niger. for the exploitation of oil, again through the same pipeline, and all sorts of deals will have to be made, obviously, with the Chinese of how much you're going to pay us for having the oil transported. So once again, this whole spat, if you like, between Mali and Algeria puts pressure on the alliance of Sahelian states, the AES, because now suddenly you see that these different countries have different interests, apart from the one shared interest, which is to maintain the juntas in power, to make sure that all the military rulers remain there for as long as they want. But apart from that, you can see that the national interests start differing. And this is something that Algeria can use to its advantage, because let's be very clear about this. A military confrontation between any of the AES countries and Algeria is going to be an absolute disaster for the Sahel. And not only because of the human costs, the fact that we'll have even more refugees, homes destroyed, lives lost, etc., but the combined force of the Algerian military is 4 times that of all the AES countries combined. So if there's one thing that needs to be avoided, then it's obviously a military confrontation between Algeria on the one hand and Mali and its AES partners on the other. And unfortunately, because none of these countries involved are now a member of the Organization of West African States, ECOWAS. The 3 Sahel countries have left. Algeria never was a member. Algeria is in the Maghreb, which is, Mauritania, Morocco, Tunisia, Libya. And so, who's going to mediate? That's the big question. And so far, there is no answer to this question, with the possibility, maybe, that it's a big maybe, of Senegal, but we don't know that.
If you want to see us in quality studio, if you want to see our podcast growing very far, we want you to please subscribe to this channel, like, comment, and share. Thank you very much, Mr. Brown. I want us to look at another aspect of our discussion. You touched them a bit in your previous statement. Those things has to do with let's say, the geopolitical configuration of the region. What do you think international players such as France, Great Britain, Russia is playing, especially with the increase of Wagner Group presence in the region, as well as most of the countries in the region trying to kick out the French troops? What do you think? What consequences does this have on political governance? And with the increase of insecurity, especially terrorism, what are some of the broader consequences it will have on the region, not in the Sahel, but also West African region, like you talked about the ECOWAS?
Thank you very much for this question, Mohammed. Yeah, there is a lot to unpack and uncover here. First of all, let's start with the 3 military juntas who came to power, almost all of them in what you can easily describe as a palace coup. The first one in Bamako in August 2020 was basically a difference of opinion between the then president, the late Ibrahim Boubacar Keita, and the chief of his own security detail, which he was about to fire this man. His name escapes me right now. Former President Keita was about to fire the head of his security detail. And what did this man do? Well, he was obviously unhappy about the prospect of losing his job. So he went up the road from the presidential palace in Bamako. It's just one road that leads up to a place called Kati. And Kati is, and always has been, the military headquarters. It's where the army has its headquarters. And there he found his friends, including the then Colonel Assimi Goïta and many others, Sadio Wag and Sadio Camara, Ismail Wag. And he said, listen, this President Keita is about to fire me. What are we going to do about it? And so the decision was made, we'll go down the road to the presidential palace and teach him a lesson, which became the coup. The coup was widely welcomed in Mali at the time because President Boubacar Keita was incredibly unpopular. He had managed the encroachment by jihadist forces on his country very badly. And so that was obviously an argument for the army to take over. And the economy was doing very badly as well. People were desperately poor. And so there was a lot of malcontent and dissatisfaction with his regime. And certainly during his second term of office, he was re-elected in 2018. I was present during that election. And after his confirmation as president of Mali again for the second time in 2018, there was basically only one standing operating procedure in that government, and that was corruption. It's got so bad that people were really losing every hope about this country ever being able to improve itself. So that was Mali. It was a palace coup against probably an unlawful decision to fire the head of the security detail for the president. A carbon copy of that situation happened in Niger. General Chiani belongs to the same national elite, a military political elite, as the president he deposed and the president before him. Both Issoufou and Bazoum, who were civilian elected presidents, came out of the same political military elite, which has been a revolving door government since 1974, when there was a coup by a man called Senou Kounché, who took power by force of arms. And there has been this constant changing of the guards, military, civilian, coup, military, civilian, etc. There is no fundamental difference between the background and the circles in which General Chiani moves and the man he deposed. Burkina Faso was basically born out of dissatisfaction with another very weak president, Kaboré, who again was very, very badly managing the Islamic insurgents in his country and was deposed precisely for that reason. What we have to be very honest if we make an assessment, a couple of years into these coups. And the first is that the situation hasn't improved. It has deteriorated, both security-wise and economy-wise. These countries are in a worse position now than they were before these coups. And secondly, there is hardly any prospect of improvement on both fronts. The economy is performing extremely badly. Obviously, hardly anybody is going to invest in the country that's run by a perennially unstable military regime. And thirdly, the security situation, being as bad as it is and deteriorating, doesn't encourage people to come over and put money into the country. So, for instance, the governments of Mali and Burkina Faso do get money, but they get it from here. They get it from Côte d'Ivoire because there is a plethora of informal contacts through which money is channeled towards the military regimes in Bamako and in Ouagadougou. And these are strong and very powerful networks that have been in place for a long time and keep functioning, no matter what the nature of the government on the other side of the border. All I'm saying here is basically that the anti-Western rhetoric was tagged onto something that was mostly a military palace coup that had absolutely nothing to do with what France was doing there or what anybody else was doing there. So that's one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is obviously the presence of French military personnel on the soil of countries that are 60 plus years independent is absurd. There should be no French soldiers in Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, Mali, wherever. It's a colonial hangover that should have stopped many, many, many decades ago. It is absolutely absurd that you still have French soldiers, that you still had French soldiers, most of them are on the way out now, in these supposedly former colonies, because it basically confirms that France still considers itself like the master of the game in these countries, and they are nominally sovereign states. So it makes no sense. It really makes no sense. The problem with that issue, and specifically in the countries of the Sahel, which are fighting these asymmetrical wars against insurgents, is that their armies are very weak, mostly ill-disciplined and badly organized, and that they do not have a functioning intelligence service, which is the first thing you need when you want to combat a terrorist issue. And you don't even have to go far to find out how that can be successfully done. Because if you go over to Mauritania, And I had a talk from the former head of Mauritanian intelligence, who gave a presentation not very long ago about how Mauritania dealt with its Islamic insurgent problem. And the first thing he mentioned was, you need a functioning intelligence service so that you can know where they are, what they're up to, what their plans are, and you can stop them. And then obviously you need popular support for the efforts against Islamic insurgents and all sorts of other different things, law enforcement, if needed, effective military action. Mali hasn't got any of those things. Burkina Faso hasn't got any of those things. Niger hasn't got any of those things. They are having intelligence services, but the intelligence services are used to spy on the opposition to the governments in place. They are not there to spy on menaces to national sovereignty or threats to the population at large. So this is a fundamental difference. And with the departure of France, already very shaky security system has completely collapsed. Russia doesn't change anything. It sends arms. It probably uses Mali as a conduit also to send arms through to its other theaters on the African continent, most notably the Central African Republic, where it's basically the de facto government through Wagner. And it obviously takes a colossal amount of gold from both Mali and Burkina Faso to finance its war against Ukraine. So that's $2.5–3 billion over the past 2 years have disappeared from both countries, and probably other countries as well, including Sudan before the war, including the Central African Republic. And all that goes into the coffers of the Russian state eventually, which it uses to finance its war against Ukraine. So Russia really has no other interest than having geostrategic pawns in the Sahel, which it can maintain on the cheap, because none of these juntas are expensive. They're all cheap. And obviously to have a supply of resources they need to finance its own war, which it finds massively more important than three obscure countries in the Sahel that hardly anybody in Russia's ever heard about.
You've talked extensively about so many things here, especially the role of Russia. From the beginning of the conversation, we focus on that a lot. I want us to look at the population perspectives. Uh, Cultural, religious, and historical identities in those countries, especially in Mali and in that of Algeria. Uh, how does those issues shape policy formulation in the region or in those countries locally, as with respect to Western or anti-Western ideologies? What do you think is happening within that perspective?
Well, if you talk to anybody in Mali and also in Algeria or anywhere else for that matter, you will realize that there are two things that are very important and two things that are matter absolutely immensely to ordinary people anywhere in this part of the world, and those are family and religion. Malians take family extremely seriously, and they take religion, in this particular case, most of the time, this is Islam. They take that very seriously. The outlook on life of most people is fairly conservative. They don't really feel that there is much to be gained from adopting all kinds of Western quaint modernisms that they don't really feel any relationship to. So they tend to ignore most of that. And what most people really want is to be left alone, live their lives, run their families, go to the mosque, be good, devout Muslims, and live their lives according to the precepts of their faith, of their religion. And that means, be respectful, be a devout follower of Allah, and be respectful to others, to strangers. Be generous, because Malians, and to a fault, to also people in Burkina Faso and elsewhere in the Sahel, are extremely generous, especially to visitors. It's something that never fails to amaze me, the fact that people, no matter how little they have, people will share. If you go to Ségou, for instance, in about 3 hours drive from Bamako, what you see there at noon, when it's lunchtime, you see guys driving their motorcycles, and they're all carrying food. Where's that food going? Well, it comes from families and it goes to other people in need. Or there is a whole system of exchange which revolves around food. And that's just that sort of giving and accepting relationship that keeps a society together. And religion, especially in this case Islam, plays a very important central role in this. And it's the glue that holds the society together, even and especially on a smaller scale like this. So it is that it's the importance of family and the importance of religion and a fairly conservative outlook on life. And obviously also the fact that the West is presented as um, a part of the world where we have all kinds of rather strange decadent things going on. Most of this is obviously very exaggerated, but I think there is another aspect to it which I think is even more important. And it's got to do with the colonial past. And it's got to do with the many, many, many crimes that the French, the British, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Belgians committed on the African continent. The countless people that were killed, the countless people that were maltreated, tortured, put in slavery situations, the many, many millions that were illegally trafficked and shipped across the ocean as human cargo, which is the most dehumanizing thing you can possibly do to an individual, to a human being. All that history, which Europe is trying to forget, it's trying to live in this state of collective amnesia. And obviously, people here have not forgotten. They have not forgotten the blood-soaked campaign of two French military men in the 19th century who went through Algeria and then Niger on the way to Lake Chad and murdered, we don't even know how many thousands of people. Captain Voulet and his colleague. We have people like Archinard who conquered, in inverted commas, large tracts of Mali and committed crimes on the way. The looting that has been going on, the cultural vandalism that has been going on, the destruction of libraries. That's what's happened in Senegal, for instance, in the 19th century. All these crimes, all these colonial crimes have not been forgotten by people who live on this continent. Although Europe tries very hard to pretend none of this ever happened, but obviously it did happen. I'll give you one more example. The railway from here, Abidjan, into Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso was built by slave labor, basically. Let's call a spade a spade. These were workers who were mostly taken out of Burkina Faso and set to work on the railway. And we don't know how many died. We don't know how many lost their lives in the construction of this railway. But there is one small town which is named after the one French engineer who was killed in an altercation between himself and some workers on that railway. I think the town is called Rubio, but you will have to forgive me for that because I haven't got that straight ready in my mind. But you can see the absurdity of the situation that you are building this 1,300-kilometer railway from Abidjan to Ouagadougou, and you don't even bother to find out how many of your African workers lost their lives working on that railway. But the one Frenchman who died has got a town named after him, and I think it's high time that the authorities here started changing the name of that town, or maybe keep it as a kind of historical reminder of how bad and how criminal in nature the colonial enterprise was. So this is very much, I think, at the center of what we are calling anti-Western sentiment. But the biggest issue here, I think, is the memory loss in Europe and the memory that is still very much alive, and quite rightly so, on the African continent about the many crimes committed in the name of colonialism and slavery. And that should not be forgotten and should certainly not be buried under a thick layer of amnesia. And that, I think, is the central issue. So there is not so much an anti-Western sentiment as there is a realization what the West did to the African continent and what the West refuses obstinately to acknowledge.
I want us to look at another aspect of the discussion: the role of Turkey in the region. Turkey is currently selling or building mosque in Niger, while at the same time selling drones to them? Is it using political religions as means of being influential power in the world or in the region? Also, when you spoke about Europe's role, recently Europe prides itself on the power, soft power, as a normative power in the world. They are not influenced. They don't get involved into war. They don't get involved into other things that other people are doing in other parts of the world. But I believe that largely has to do with Europe's historical past. Because if you think, almost all of the great wars that we have experienced in the world all have started right here in Europe. So I think that's one reason that Europe is not trying to erase, to have memory lost of what is happening. So can you tell us about Turkey's role, especially using religion or using Islam as a means of getting influence in the region of Sahel?
Yes, thank you very much for that, Mohammed. It's a geopolitical game. Turkey's influence and growing influence on the African continent started at the beginning of this century, when it became clear that Turkey, which is an aspiring middle-ranking power, wanted to gain influence on the African continent. It was famously the first country to open direct flights between Istanbul, which is its main airline hub, and Somalia, for instance, after the war ended. And they have been steadily building on this relationship. It is astonishing how many destinations Turkish Airlines has on the African continent. You can go and look it up, but there's hardly any capital on this continent where they don't fly to. That's obviously a sign of economic aspirations. And I think Islam is indeed an integral part of that, if only because, President Erdogan obviously has played up his Islamic credentials and wishes to announce to the world that, as far as he's concerned, Islam is an integral part of Turkish foreign policy. So the two go together. Whether or not this is a kind of a counter against the other major power, which has been building mosques in this part of the world for much longer, Saudi Arabia, which has been using its particular brand of Islam as a battering ram to gain influence throughout the region, and they've been doing this for at least 60 years, if not longer. The two don't seem to clash very virulently, so both are jostling for geopolitical positions. Turkey has a very diversified economy. It has industries. It builds drones, as you well know, because the drone that was shot down over Mali, Algeria, was a Turkish one. Turkey is a major exporter and manufacturer of drones. They're also very strong in things like building. You will find Turkish building activity, for instance, here all over Abidjan. There are Turkish companies working. In competition mainly with Moroccans, who are also great in building roads and edifices and all that sort of thing. So there is both a geopolitical interest and there is an economic interest by Turkey on the African continent, because it's business. There's business to be made. There's money to be made. There's business to be done. And Turkey manufactures and exports stuff that this continent wants. And indeed, because we have a number of conflicts that don't seem to come any closer to any resolution, because I can tell you the Sahel will carry on as it is, unfortunately, for the next decade or so, if not longer. So there will be demand for these kind of weapons. And obviously, the stuff that France and other European nations make is far too expensive. And Turkey can produce these drones at a favorable rate, and maybe even do a discount and gain influence in that direction as well. Both political and geopolitical clout, in combination with business, works very well in combination. So that's the kind of place where Turkey is, and Turkey is definitely going to expand its influence across the African continent, both through the spread of Islam, perhaps its brand of Islam, which doesn't clash so terribly with the Sufi traditions as compared to the Saudi Salafi variant, which is much more rigid and much more joyless, I should say, as compared to the Senegalese, indeed, the Brotherhoods, many of them are in Senegal, which have always been very joyful affairs. And so that probably will have less of a clash in the sense of the Turkish Islamization of the continent. The thing really is here that it's, if you go down to the bottom line of it, it's geopolitical influence. And there are a number of mid-level nations, aspiring mid-level nations, jostling for influence on the continent through business, sometimes in combination with religion, also without religion. Countries like Brazil, for instance, which are trying to sell their planes here and get iron ore out of the grounds, because one of the biggest steel makers in the world is Vale, a Brazilian company. Countries like India, which are trying to get their influence mostly on the eastern part of the continent. Definitely Turkey, definitely Morocco, which is, to all intents and purposes, an African country, but seeks to integrate its economy more and more into the West African economy. So there are all these different forces at work. And as far as the United States are concerned, I think they've rendered themselves pretty much irrelevant by shutting down USAID, by shutting down the healthcare programs, by shutting down the Voice of America, which was, all these were manifestations of American soft power, by imposing tariffs, for instance, 21% on Cote d'Ivoire. It's a fantasy figure. No one knows where that comes from. By imposing 50% tariffs on poor Lesotho, which basically puts an end to the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, which was an old initiative dating back to, I think, the Clinton years even. So I think, as far as from an African perspective, I think you can just simply forget about any useful American influence. So very much so, as long as Donald Trump is in power, and we don't know how long that's going to be. So that's very much in the background. The ones to watch are still Europe, because Europe has an obsession. It has a double obsession. It has an obsession with keeping migrants out, which I think is essentially racist and is essentially also part of this whole memory loss program that they're engaged in. And they are obsessed with stopping terrorists, which in many European minds are one and the same thing, which is obviously nonsensical. But, try to explain the arrival of the extreme right in Europe, and this is where you arrive at. And then obviously you've got these other players that we've already mentioned. And China. China is doing business. China is building infrastructure. China is, making sure that it has a long-lasting interest in the continent. And the big difference that you have between the Chinese time perspective and those of many other countries is that China doesn't think in terms of years. It doesn't even think in terms of decades. China thinks in terms of centuries. They have a much longer time perspective. And so they're not in a hurry to do anything hastily, to, get involved in all sorts of short-term little projects. They're not interested in that. They want to build long-lasting economic, business, and political ties. And they've got time. They've got time. And most others do not have that time because of the domestic political processes, because of more pressing issues at home. China is obviously the one to watch. And I think China's influence on the African continent is certainly set to grow even stronger than it already is.
Yeah, now we are almost coming to an end of this edition of Unpopular Opinion. Uh, just two more questions. I want to ask you, from your perspective, what do you think regional countries can cooperate together to strengthen governance, especially to fight against extremism and bad governance in the region?
Oh, that's a good one. The first thing that is required, obviously, is government transparency, and unfortunately, we haven't had a lot of that in the past years and decades. Um, Not for want of trying, I think, because there are in civil society many forces at work which are trying to increase government transparency. The problem is that the governments always regard demands for more transparency as a direct attack on those governments. So the reaction is always hostile, and that's a big impediment um, for increasing transparency. And another thing, obviously, that also springs to mind here is political financing. Most political parties, there's no way of counting how many there are, for instance, in a place like Cote d'Ivoire here, or even Senegal. But most political parties are vehicles for individuals who are looking for political influence, and through that political influence are looking at self-enrichment schemes. The process known as rent seeking. The ones that are financing these political parties are the ones that are looking to, gain influence with this particular standard bearer individual, so they can profit as well. So it's not so much a vision of how to improve a country as a business model. That's very much the way Donald Trump operates. He hasn't got any vision, but he has definitely got the ambition to enrich himself at the expense of the American people and taxpayers. The same sort of thing applies here. It's rare that you find a leader who is actually willing to improve the people's difficult circumstances by having a vision for the country. Thomas Sankara was one of those. He had a vision how to improve the lives of the ordinary Burkina Faso people. But yeah, again, I mean, he was eliminated. We don't even know exactly who by. The finger is always pointed at France, but we do know that the former president of this country, Félix Houphouët-Boigny, had a particular animus against Thomas Sankara. So we don't know who is ultimately responsible for who finished that particular regime, if you like. So, but there are very few people who actually have a vision. Okay, this is how we should be working on improving our country. And with the lack of that vision, also comes the lack of a wish, a desire to be transparent. Because if you don't tell people what your goals are, how are you going to explain to people how you're going to get there? And how are you going to finance these beautiful things that you want? It's all very opaque. It's all very untransparent, and it's very difficult to see that change anytime soon. I'm sorry to have to be so pessimistic, but that's where we are. And the military regimes are even worse. The simple reason that the military regimes, as we have, for instance, Burkina Faso is the worst case at this particular point in time. They respond to criticisms or requests for transparency with deadly violence. The number of people who have been killed, wrongfully incarcerated, executed, sent to the front in forced recruitment exercises, tortured, and simply disappeared, including some of my colleagues who have disappeared without a single trace. The number runs in the hundreds now. And all of these were people who were requesting, can you tell us what your vision is? Can you tell us how you're going to get there? And the simple, most honest answer obviously has to be there is no vision and we don't know how to get there. But obviously, as a military ruler or even a civilian ruler, but certainly as a military ruler, that's not the answer you can give. So what do? You silence your critics. And in the case of Burkina, that is done very literally. So I'm afraid this is pretty much where we are.
What is the way forward for peace in the region, especially Burkina Faso, Mali, Algeria, Niger? What do you think is the way forward, as they have declared themselves an attack on any of them is an attack on the entire is an attack on the three countries? So what do you think is the way forward? And besides that, what role do you think young people need to play in this perspective, especially with what is happening? So much disinformation is going on around these three countries. What do you think common people who are in the street, who do not understand big grammar, who do not understand all of these political terminologies, what do you think they need to do? Young people, elderly people, and women. What do you think we can do, and what is the way forward for peace?
Oh, that's a huge question to end with. Um, I don't have a magic wand, so there is no real sort of this and this answer will solve all the issues. But I think a continuation of what has been going on already, which is obviously, demands transparency, demands that we know where the money comes from and where it is going. If you cast your minds back to once again Burkina Faso in October 2014, there was a popular uprising. against the then sitting French-backed autocrat Blaise Compaoré, who lives here in Abidjan, by the way. And what people demanded was a simple thing, namely that he kept to his own constitution, which says you can no longer remain in power. And so when he refused to do that, they chased him out. Now, these are obviously, extreme examples, because it is hard to see how you can do that every time and all the time when there is a leader who doesn't perform or breaks the law or doesn't do or does corrupt things. But I think there is a constant push on the part of civil society, especially local civil society, to demand transparency. And if you demand transparency, you also tackle the issue of disinformation. Social media are here with us to stay. They have an absolutely horrendously bad influence on opinion forming, because you can lie with impunity on social media, because there is no fact checking going on. There is no editorial board that says, no, you can't say this because I have checked this back in the day when this and this and this happened. So what you're saying here is factually incorrect. There is no correcting mechanism on any of the social media. And the fact that has gone on now for 10, 15, 20 years has brought us the return of Donald Trump to the White House and the rise of the extreme right in Europe, among other things, and indeed different types of populism in, for instance, the Sahel. The fact that, for instance, the rhetoric against the French, however much the French merit being kicked out of these countries because of their colonial pasts, but the fact that anti-French rhetoric could be tagged on to something that was a run-of-the-mill military palace coup speaks to the extent to which you can be lied to about why people do what they do. Why do you have a coup? Because you want to get rid of the previous president, because you disagree with the previous president, and because you want his job. That's the basic thing. It's a bit more mundane than that. It's got nothing to do with any grand vision about this is where we're going to take our country. Only very few people have that vision, and none of the ones that are in power right now have that vision. None of them. When it comes to bringing peace, which should obviously be an integral part of that vision for either Mali or Burkina Faso or Niger, there is none. All the countries that border Burkina Faso, be it Togo, be it Ghana, be it Cote d'Ivoire, be it Benin, they all complain about the fact that on the other side of the border, when they look across into Burkina Faso, there is no one. That means that that border region remains completely unprotected. And the added difficulty here is that there are national parks that straddle the borders between Burkina Faso and all these countries. National parks were a colonial invention, looking at wildlife, and the locals could be servants, basically. It's a colonial project. And national parks are with us now in a very negative way, in that they serve as attack bases for jihadist extremists, because they're empty. Hardly anybody lives there. People were chased out of these places because of the wildlife, which colonials found more important than the people actually living there. And so these have become empty spaces where, of course, jihadist extremists can set up bases and raid the environment to their heart's content. And this has been going on for years now in these borderlands, in these border regions. The Ivorian government seems to have some kind of a solution, in that they did what any normal, sane government would do: go there, talk to the people who live there, ask them what they want, ask them what their projects, what their problems are, and try to address those problems. I haven't seen any other government in the region, and certainly not a military government in the region, taking that particular approach. Peace will come only when people have got something to lose by keeping the peace. These wars, these insurgencies, these rebellions are fought mostly by young people who've got nothing to lose, because they've got no prospects, they've got no jobs, they've got no economic security. And so if someone comes by as a recruiter, Charles Taylor fashion, which is what I covered in Liberia at the time, and say, listen, if you raid that house or if you rob that shop, I will give you $10. That's how it works. And then how did these youths that I spoke to after the wars in Liberia and Sierra Leone, but mostly Liberia, how did they describe their looting sprees? They called it work. That's what they were doing. They considered themselves now unemployed because they were unable to do what they were doing before because the wars had ended. And so this kind of criminal economy is what you get if you don't address the basic issues that people are grappling with, which are things like the cost of living, economic prospects, build a decent economy that can, facilitate people's incomes and make sure that they have something that they can lose rather than make sure that they have nothing to lose, because if people have nothing to lose, they will pick up guns and start fighting. And unfortunately, we are in a part of the world where it is very easy to get your hands on guns because there are thousands and thousands and thousands in circulation and they're all cheap. You can get them pretty much at will. So this is, meaningful economic development, taking the marginalized parts of your country seriously. Don't concentrate everything in the capital or the major center, like here in Abidjan, for instance, and give people some perspective so they can actually have something to fight for, not with a gun, but with their heads and with their hands.
Thank you very much for your insight on this edition of Unpopular Opinion. It has been an absolute honor. Thank you for the great work you are doing uncovering the truth in the West African region. And to our listeners, if this conversation moved you, I encourage you to support us by subscribing, share, as well as follow us on all of our social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter. Until we meet again in our next conversation, let's keep the conversation alive, stay engaged, stay informed, stay unapologetically Africans.